single night really end 45 years of fear? In the early hours of mid-January 2026, Tehran delivered an answer that stunned even seasoned observers of the Islamic Republic. What unfolded was not a protest spiraling out of control, but a psychological rupture, one that quietly dismantled the regime's most valuable asset, fear itself. For decades, the Basij militia had functioned as the regime's omnipresent enforcers, a force designed less to win battles than to suffocate dissent before it could breathe. Yet on that night, the balance shifted with a speed few thought possible. What happens when the force meant to terrify the population becomes the one trapped behind locked gates? As midnight approached, crowds converged near the main Basij headquarters in central Tehran. This was not spontaneous chaos. Verified footage and open-source intelligence indicate coordinated movement timing and target selection. The symbolism mattered. The Basij was not merely another security unit. It was the regime's moral police, its street-level nerve endings. When protesters surrounded that headquarters, the message was unmistakable: the fear barrier was being tested at its strongest point. When the reinforced doors finally gave way, it was more than a physical breach. The regime lost its monopoly over intimidation in real time. Protesters did not just torch vehicles or scatter documents. They seized control of the narrative. Detention cells were opened, symbols of imprisonment destroyed, and images of burning Basij trucks spread across the city within minutes. In authoritarian systems, perception is power. That night, perception collapsed faster than concrete. This turning point cannot be understood without context. For months, Iran's leadership had relied on a familiar escalation ladder: arrests, targeted killings, internet shutdowns, and controlled violence. The assumption mirrored other historical crackdowns, that overwhelming force would paralyze the population. But by January 2026, Iranian society had changed. Economic pressure, isolation, and generational fatigue had eroded the regime's deterrence. Fear no longer functioned as a stable currency. Reports from multiple districts show that Basij units failed to establish defensive perimeters. Officers abandoned positions or remained locked inside compounds. In previous years, the mere sound of a single motorcycle patrol could empty a street. That night, thousands stood their ground. Analysts note that this was the first time the Basij's intimidation doctrine collapsed simultaneously across multiple neighborhoods. The regime attempted to frame the events as isolated riots. Yet fires burned in districts separated by kilometers, indicating parallel action rather than contagion alone. Tehran's municipal control effectively evaporated for hours. From a strategic perspective, this represented a loss of urban dominance, a condition militaries are trained to avoid at all costs. Once the streets no longer belong to the state, authority becomes theoretical. Western security analysts watching the footage described the moment as a fear inversion. Instead of crowds dispersing at the sight of uniformed men, the uniforms became liabilities. This inversion matters far beyond Iran. NATO planners and U.S. policymakers under President Donald Trump's administration view such moments as early indicators of regime destabilization, particularly in states that rely heavily on internal security forces rather than public legitimacy. Importantly, no foreign military action triggered this collapse. It emerged from within, driven by collective recognition rather than command structures. That is why comparisons to earlier protests fall short. This was not a demand for reform, it was a rejection of fear as a governing tool. By dawn, Tehran was quieter, but not subdued. The silence did not signal submission. It marked recalibration. The regime still possessed weapons, prisons, and loyalists. What it had lost was psychological dominance, the invisible wall that had kept its institutions standing for nearly half a century. Meanwhile, As images from that night raced beyond Tehran, events in other cities began moving with alarming speed, revealing that the breach was only the beginning. By sunrise, it was clear that Tehran had not erupted in isolation. The shockwave traveled outward with a precision that unsettled the regime's planners. Cities once considered peripheral suddenly became central to the story, exposing a structural weakness the authorities had long tried to conceal. Control once assumed to radiate outward from the capital was now dissolving in multiple directions at once. How quickly can a state lose the streets beyond its capital? In Babel, hundreds of kilometers north of Tehran, crowds moved with a purpose that suggested preparation rather than imitation. Police stations and Basij centers were not randomly targeted. They were selected as nodes of repression. Footage from the city shows buildings already engulfed in flames before any meaningful security response could be organized. This mattered. When repression infrastructure burns faster than reinforcements can arrive, a regime's deterrence loop breaks. The same pattern emerged in Qom, a city heavy with religious symbolism. Here the regime had long assumed ideological loyalty would substitute for force. Yet even there, security vehicles were blocked, bases surrounded, and patrols withdrawn. Analysts tracking the events noted a crucial shift. Protesters were no longer testing limits, they were exploiting gaps. The state's reaction time, once measured in minutes, stretched into hours. Martial law declarations followed broadcast with familiar language and familiar threats. Yet they remained largely theoretical. A law without enforcement is not authority. It is theater. The mechanism meant to impose order, the Basij and local police, had been either overwhelmed or pinned inside their own facilities. In several districts, armored vehicles failed to enter narrow streets not because of superior firepower on the other side, but because crowds controlled access points with improvised barricades. This loss of territorial control has deep implications. Modern regimes depend on what security experts call area denial, the ability to make public space too dangerous for collective action. In Babel and neighboring towns, that doctrine collapsed. Crowds denied the state access instead. The psychological shift mirrored Tehran's rupture, but with a critical difference, it confirmed the pattern was scalable. Western observers compared the spread to a domino effect, but that analogy understates the coordination involved. Communication persisted despite internet restrictions, aided by satellite connections and decentralized networks. Images of burning stations in one city appeared on screens in another within minutes, collapsing the regime's attempt to isolate unrest geographically. For NATO analysts and U.S. intelligence under President Trump, this represented a warning sign seen in few modern uprisings, a population capable of maintaining narrative momentum under digital siege. The regime responded with escalating force. Live ammunition was deployed more widely, and casualty numbers began to climb sharply. Leaked figures cited by international media suggested fatalities reaching into the thousands within days. Historically, such numbers would have emptied streets. This time, they did not. Funerals turned into rallies. Mourning became mobilization. Each attempt at suppression widened the pool of participants rather than shrinking it. Strategically, this created an impossible dilemma. To regain control, the regime would need overwhelming force across multiple cities simultaneously. Yet deploying that force risked accelerating defections and moral collapse within the ranks. Intelligence assessments indicated declining morale among lower-level units, particularly those drawn from economically strained neighborhoods. Loyalty once assumed now required constant reinforcement. As fires burned in city after city, the regime's myth of omnipresence crumbled. Authority no longer flowed downward from Tehran. It leaked outward through cracks the state could not seal. The collapse was no longer symbolic, it was operational. Yet even as territorial control slipped away, The regime doubled down on violence, betting that fear could still be resurrected. What followed next shocked analysts even further, revealing that brute force alone could not reverse the tide. The regime's next move followed a script familiar to students of authoritarian survival: overwhelm, intimidate, and silence. Yet in January 2026, that script produced an outcome few in Tehran or abroad had anticipated. Instead of restoring control, violence accelerated the regime's unraveling, exposing the limits of fear when a society crosses a psychological point of no return. Can mass repression still work when fear has already collapsed? According to figures circulating among international news organizations and human rights monitors, the death toll from live fire over the course of a single week likely exceeded several thousand. The exact number remains contested, but the scale alone sent a clear message: the state had declared war on its own population. In previous decades, such bloodshed would have emptied streets overnight. This time, the streets filled again by evening. This reaction marked a profound deviation from historical precedent. The regime appeared to be attempting a Tiananmen-style reset, one decisive strike to impose silence. But Iran in 2026 was not China in 1989. Information traveled faster, collective memory was sharper, and legitimacy was already eroded by years of economic isolation and internal corruption. Violence, instead of intimidating, clarified the stakes. Each funeral became a mobilization point. Processions expanded into demonstrations, and demonstrations hardened into resistance. Sociologists observing the pattern described a threshold effect. Once casualties reach a certain magnitude, fear no longer discourages participation. Instead, moral outrage replaces self-preservation as the dominant motivator. That threshold, analysts argue, was crossed decisively within days. From a military standpoint, the crackdown also revealed operational weaknesses. Security forces were forced to spread thin across multiple cities, diluting their effectiveness. Ammunition, logistics, and command cohesion came under strain. Reports emerged of units refusing orders or withdrawing rather than engaging crowds directly. The very scale of repression accelerated internal fragmentation. Western defense analysts, including those advising NATO governments, noted another crucial factor: legitimacy decay within the ranks. Many Basija and police members came from the same neighborhoods now under fire. The cognitive dissonance of enforcing lethal orders against familiar streets proved corrosive. Loyalty, once sustained by ideology and economic privilege, now demanded personal sacrifice without a credible future reward. The regime's reliance on maximum force also triggered international consequences. Under President Donald Trump's administration, U.S. officials signaled that further escalation would harden Western positions, not soften them. Sanctions enforcement tightened, and diplomatic isolation deepened. Rather than deterring external pressure, the crackdown amplified it. Strategically, the regime found itself trapped. Reducing violence risked signaling weakness. Increasing it risked total collapse. Every additional casualty narrowed the path back to control. Analysts described this as a classic blowback spiral where repression generates the very instability it seeks to prevent. Perhaps most damaging was the symbolic inversion. The state's weapons, once instruments of terror, became evidence of desperation. Images of armed men firing into crowds no longer communicated strength. They confirmed vulnerability. Fear, the regime's foundational currency, depreciated rapidly. Yet even as violence failed to restore order, something else began to shift on the ground. Protesters adapted, learned, and reorganized. The confrontation was no longer purely emotional, it was becoming tactical. What followed next shocked analysts even more as the streets themselves transformed into contested terrain. As repression failed to restore fear, the confrontation entered a new phase, one that revealed how quickly an unarmed population can adapt when survival replaces protest as the primary objective. What emerged on the streets was not chaos, but learning under pressure. Tactics evolved faster than the regime's command structure could respond. How did ordinary neighborhoods turn into obstacles the state could no longer cross? For years, the regime's most effective tool of urban control had been speed. Motorcycle units, light, aggressive, and psychologically intimidating, were designed to disperse crowds before they could solidify. Their engines alone once signaled the end of any gathering. By mid-January 2026, that advantage had evaporated. The same narrow streets that once enabled rapid response now became traps. Footage verified by independent analysts shows protesters exploiting urban terrain with growing sophistication. Barricades appeared at choke points. Debris, metal frames, and burning objects slowed vehicles to a crawl. Once isolated motorcycle units were overwhelmed, their mobility neutralized. In several documented cases, units abandoned their bikes and fled on foot. The hunter had become the hunted. Equally significant was the vertical dimension of resistance. In dense neighborhoods, residents coordinated from balconies and rooftops using height to disrupt advances without direct confrontation. Objects dropped from above forced security forces to retreat, transforming ordinary apartment blocks into defensive structures. Military analysts described this as a rudimentary form of urban area denial, improvised but effective. This shift had cascading consequences. The regime's rapid response doctrine relied on intimidation, not sustained engagement. Once speed and surprise were gone, its units lacked the training and morale for prolonged street combat against dispersed civilian resistance. Armored vehicles deployed in response fared no better. Their size and noise made them vulnerable in confined streets, while crowds controlled access routes long before vehicles arrived. From a strategic perspective, this represented a doctrinal failure. The regime had built its internal security around suppression, not counterinsurgency. When faced with decentralized resistance, its tools proved mismatched. Western military observers compared the situation to early stages of urban conflicts elsewhere, where state forces lost initiative by underestimating civilian adaptability. The implications reached beyond Iran. NATO planners and U.S. analysts under President Donald Trump's administration paid close attention to how quickly non-state actors neutralized mechanized advantages using terrain and coordination rather than firepower. The lesson was uncomfortable. Internal security forces optimized for fear collapse rapidly once fear dissipates. Morale within the ranks deteriorated further. Motorcycle units, once symbols of dominance, became liabilities. Videos circulating online showed abandoned equipment and retreating formations. Each image reinforced the narrative that the regime was losing not only control, but competence. In authoritarian systems, perceived incompetence is often more dangerous than dissent itself. At the same time, the regime resorted to increasingly desperate measures. Reports emerged of deception tactics, security personnel using civilian cover and emergency vehicles to reposition or escape. While intended to regain tactical flexibility, these actions backfired catastrophically. Trust eroded not only between state and society, but within society itself as civilians became suspicious of symbols once considered neutral. Strategically, the regime faced a shrinking menu of options. Conventional force had failed. Psychological dominance was gone. Tactical adaptation by protesters outpaced institutional learning. The conflict was no longer about dispersing crowds. It was about reclaiming legitimacy, a far more difficult task. Yet beneath the street-level battles lay a deeper problem. Tactical failure was only a symptom. The real collapse was structural, rooted in corruption, fractured loyalty, and moral exhaustion. And that underlying rot was about to surface in full view. Beneath the burning streets and collapsing tactics lay a deeper truth the regime could no longer conceal. The crisis was not merely one of control, but of structure, an internal decay years in the making that now surfaced under pressure. What unraveled in January was not just a security apparatus, but the social contract that had sustained it. Why did loyalty fracture so quickly once fear stopped working? For decades, the Basiji and the broader security network had been presented as guardians of the revolution, defenders of the oppressed. In practice, they had evolved into something far more complex and far more corrosive. Investigative reporting by major international outlets over recent years had already exposed extensive involvement of security-linked foundations in real estate ports, energy transit, and informal trade. By 2026, this economic entanglement had become impossible to ignore. To many Iranians, the uniforms in front of them no longer represented order or ideology. They represented a cartel. Control over private ports, preferential access to foreign currency, and opaque financial channels created a parallel economy that insulated elites, while the broader population absorbed inflation, unemployment, and isolation. When protesters attacked Basij facilities, they were not only striking symbols of repression, they were targeting the visible nodes of economic injustice. This perception mattered enormously for morale inside the ranks. Lower-level members, often drawn from economically marginalized communities, faced a stark calculation. They were asked to risk their lives defending a system whose benefits flowed upward, not outward. Analysts tracking internal communications reported growing disillusionment, reluctance to engage, and in some cases, quiet desertion. Loyalty built on fear erodes rapidly once fear loses credibility. To compensate, the regime reportedly leaned on external manpower. Fighters linked to allied militias from neighboring countries were deployed to reinforce overstretched units. While this temporarily bolstered numbers, it carried severe strategic costs. Foreign enforcers further delegitimized the state, confirming protesters' claims that the regime no longer trusted its own people. Historically, regimes that outsource repression signal weakness rather than strength. Equally damaging was the collapse of moral authority. Reports emerged of security forces misusing protected civilian symbols to maneuver through contested areas. Whether accurate in every detail or not, the perception alone was devastating. Once ambulances, hospitals, and emergency services are viewed with suspicion, the state loses its last remaining claim to ethical governance. International law-side trust is the true currency, and it was gone. Western analysts emphasized that this moral collapse had strategic consequences. Under President Donald Trump's administration, U.S. officials and NATO partners increasingly framed the crisis not as a temporary unrest, but as a legitimacy failure. That framing matters. It shapes sanctions, diplomatic engagement, and contingency planning for instability beyond Iran's borders. Technology accelerated the unraveling. Attempts to suppress information through internet shutdowns failed, as alternative networks kept footage flowing. Images of burning facilities, abandoned posts, and defiant crowds circulated globally within minutes. The regime could no longer isolate cities, narratives, or audiences. Information dominance, once assumed, slipped permanently out of reach. At this stage, the crisis had moved beyond repression versus resistance. It had become a question of survival for the leadership itself. As loyalty frayed and institutions hollowed out, attention shifted upward toward decisions being made far from the streets. And those decisions suggested that the regime was already preparing for an endgame few had dared to imagine. As the streets slipped beyond control, attention shifted upward to the leadership itself. The signals coming from the top were subtle but unmistakable. This was no longer about restoring order, it was about preserving survival options. In authoritarian systems, the moment leaders plan escape routes is often the clearest indicator that power has already begun to leak away. If a regime still believes it can win, why prepare to run? Intelligence assessments circulating among Western governments suggested heightened security movements around senior leadership compounds. Satellite imagery reviewed by independent analysts pointed to unusual activity near hardened underground facilities outside Tehran. While official statements dismissed such reports as foreign propaganda, the pattern aligned with a familiar playbook: secure archives, consolidate loyal units, and prepare contingency exits. The leadership's dilemma was strategic and deeply personal. Staying meant gambling on forces whose loyalty was visibly eroding. Leaving meant acknowledging collapse. For an aging leadership circle, time itself had become an adversary. Every additional day of unrest narrowed the range of viable outcomes. Speculation intensified around potential external lifelines. Moscow inevitably entered the discussion. For years, Tehran had framed its relationship with Russia as a strategic partnership cooperation in energy arms transfers and regional coordination. Yet partnerships between isolated states are transactional, not sentimental. From the Kremlin's perspective, accepting a weakened leader would offer little upside and considerable risk. Western analysts framed the calculus bluntly. Russia under Vladimir Putin does not collect allies. It manages interests. A deposed Iranian leader would represent a liability, another sanctioned figure complicating already strained relations with the West, particularly as Moscow remains deeply entangled in Ukraine. For the United States and its allies, this uncertainty reinforced the sense that Iran had entered an irreversible phase of internal reckoning. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. officials emphasized that Washington was not seeking to engineer outcomes inside Iran, but contingency planning intensified nonetheless. NATO governments monitored spillover risks, refugee flows, regional proxy dynamics, and disruptions to energy markets. Stability in the Gulf, already fragile, now depended on decisions being made under extreme pressure in Tehran. The most dangerous variable lay in what the leadership still controlled. Even as legitimacy evaporated, the regime retained access to sensitive intelligence weapons programs and regional networks. Analysts warned that desperate actors sometimes attempt to trade secrets for sanctuary. Such moves, if they occurred, would not stabilize the situation, they would internationalize it. Yet the deeper truth remained unavoidable. The regime's power had rested less on firepower than on fear. Once fear collapsed, every remaining tool lost effectiveness. Bunkers, convoys, and contingency flights could delay outcomes, but they could not reverse them. Authority had already shifted away from institutions toward society itself. By late January 2026, the question was no longer whether the Islamic Republic could return to its previous form. It was whether any negotiated transition could occur before chaos filled the vacuum. History offers few gentle endings for regimes that reach this stage. What began as protests had evolved into a structural collapse. The endgame was not unfolding underground or on runways, it was playing out in the collective realization that the state no longer governed the streets. And as the dust settled, analysts across capitals agreed, on one point January did not mark the end of the story, but the moment the old future became impossible.